Good morning, everybody. We are dealing with Arthur Miller's very famous drama, All My Sons. Arthur Miller, 1915 to 2005, is an American playwright and essayist in the 20th century American theater. Among his most popular plays are All My Sons, that is written in 1947, Death of a Salesman, 1949, The Crucible, 1953, and A View from the Bridge in 1955. He wrote several screenplays and was very well noted for his work on The Misfits in 1961. In fact, the drama Death of a Salesman has been numbered on the shortlist of the finest American plays in the 20th century. The present drama, All My Sons by Arthur Miller, takes place in the Keller residence. In the screen, you could see the backyard of the Keller residence, a very well established, quite rich, well settled family is the Keller family. And the name of the city or the town is not mentioned by Arthur Miller, thus indicating that it could be any of the towns uh, in American City with the American dream. The very first act of All My Sons, in fact, it is a play in 3 acts, which is set in a small town several years after the World War II, and begins with Jim Bayliss, a doctor, and Joe Keller, the head of the Keller family, sitting in Keller's backyard and reading a paper. A storm the previous night has shone in half a tree that is revealed to memorialize Larry Keller, one of the 2 children of the Keller family, the son who did not survive the war. Chris, the other Keller son and a junior partner in the family manufacturing business, comes outside and tells his father, Joe, after Jim leaves, that the family cannot continue leading on Kate, Joe's wife, in the belief that Larry is still living. Frank Lube, another neighbor of Keller's, along with his wife Lydia Lube, is using astrology to determine if Larry is alive. And he brings this information to Kate later in the play. But for the most part, Chris believes that all in the town have come to the same conclusion that after 3 years, Larry will not be returning to the small town, that Larry's plane crash in the war was fatal. Chris also tells his father that Annie, Larry's former girlfriend, who is visiting the Kellers from New York, is there in their house because Chris sends and intends to propose marriage to her. Joe has no real problem with the idea in itself, but Joe fears that Kate will not permit it because Annie is still a Larry's girl in inverted commas. And to give Annie to Chris would mean that Larry is really dead. Kate comes outside, as does Annie, and a series of strained conversations ensue, in which Chris attempts to demonstrate his affection for Annie, and Kate tries to emphasize that Larry is not still dead, and Annie is still Larry's girl, but not Chris's girl. Slowly, throughout the first act, it is revealed that Annie's father, Steve, was a former employee of Joe's at the manufacturing company during the war. In fact, they both were partners there. And that Steve apparently okayed the production of faulty plane parts which were shipped to the American planes, the fighter planes especially, and which caused the death of 21 pilots by crashing the planes. Steve went to jail for his negligence, but Joe was released, arguing in the court that Steve acted alone in this matter and that Joe did not force him to ship the defective parts. In fact, Joe was not well and did not have any role to play in this decision. Joe and Kate worry that Anne has come to stir up the trouble in the Keller family regarding Joe's guilt in the manufacturing affair, and this too complicates the possibility of Chris and Annie's wedding. Chris also tries Annie that he has a hard time navigating the moral complexities of post war life. And he relates a story from the war in which a soldier gave him his last pair of dry socks. as an indication of the moral simplicity of the battle. The second act of the play is very interesting because there is a new character that is introduced, George. George is Annie's brother, calls long distance from Columbus, where Steve is imprisoned, saying he too is going to visit the Keller home that evening. Annie worries that George is coming with revelations about Joe Steve manufacturing affair, and Kate tells Joe to prepare himself for George's questioning. George arrives in a huff, and though Jim and Chris attempt to calm him, George accuses Joe of knowingly inducing Steve to take the fall for the manufacturing failures. George believes Steve's story that Joe himself told Steve over the phone to Sherlock over the defective parts. George believes that Joe feigned sickness that evening to keep from going into the plant, thus retaining distance from the events, which enabled Joe to place the blame entirely on Steve. Joe denies these accusations of George, who leaves the house in a great hurry. But as Annie runs after him, Joe announces to Chris and in front of Kate that, in fact, George's story is very true. Now, this is very shocking revelation from Joe in the second act. Chris is aghast. Not just that his father produced the defective parts, but that Joe lied to put Steve in jail and proceeded to make a fortune from the factory in the post-war boom. In the post-war boom, Chris feels complicit in his father's immorality and gives um, a deep insight into it. So he goes for a driving that evening while Joe and Kate weep in the house, staying alone. The third act begins and it is the middle of the night. Kate is out in the yard. Chris is missing. He has gone out and has not come back. Jim comes back from a house call. He confesses to Kate that he has always known Joe as guilty. Jim is the middle person whom you could see on the slide. He tells her not to worry. Chris will definitely come back and he'll figure out how to compromise and come back. Jim offers to go and look for Chris. Now, Joe comes in upset that Jim is in his business. Kate's had about enough of her husband. She tells him that if Chris comes back, Joe should offer to turn himself in. To turn himself in would mean that to admit his crime and in front of everybody in the family. Joe can't believe this. His family wanted money, and so he has made money, even by compromising the business and putting Steve into jail. Now they are turning on him. Kate explains that for Chris, there is something bigger than the family. Joe can't understand that perspective, and he defined by his family. Anne emerges now, and she has her own agenda. She really wanted to marry Chris. She won't do anything about Joe's guilt, but she demands that Kate to admit to Chris that Larry is dead. She wants to get on with her life and marry Chris and settle. But Kate refuses, and Anne must leave her alone. Now Joe exits. Anne gets nuclear. She has a letter from Larry. She hadn't wanted actually to share it with anybody, but Kate leaves her no choice because she's not ready to accept Larry's death, and she's not giving permission to Anne for marrying Chris. So Anne, who wants Kate to believe that Larry is truly dead so that she and Chris can be married, shows to Kate this letter that was written by Larry to her just one day before his death, in which he said his plane would go missing is in inverted commas, go missing in an act of suicide out of the shame Larry feels for Joe and Steve's guilt. So Larry very well knew about the guilt and the bad work that is done by Joe and Steve together. And once Larry comes to know of Joe's guilt, he is not able to live a decent life as a pilot in the American Air Force. And so he willingly is committing suicide by crashing the plane, is what is written in the letter that Larry has written to Anne. Now it is a shock to Kate to accept all these facts. Chris shows up now and he apologizes to Anne for being a coward, for suspecting his father and not doing anything about it. He wants to put him in jail now, but he doesn't feel to react in such a way and he doesn't know how to react to his father. Anne tries to comfort Chris. She doesn't expect him to do anything about Joe, but in reality, she does expect because it is her father who is in prison because of Joe. Now, Joe comes out defensive. He tells Chris to throw his money away if he thinks that it's so dirty. He is no worse than any other man in the world. Chris knows that. He just thought Joe was better. But ultimately, he comes to understanding that his father is like no other American who lives and does anything for earning money. Anne gives Larry's letter to Chris, in which Larry confesses that uh, the planes have actually crashed only because of his father. And knowing this truth, he confesses that he plans to kill himself because of his father's guilt. Now, Joe is taken aback. He says he will turn himself in and he goes inside. Everybody is waiting outside for Joe to come back and confess the guilt. Kate still wants Chris to give it up, but he wants to go through with it just to teach them that they have to understand that there are wider consequences for their mean actions. Each person does something or the other for the betterment of his own family, but which might have the bigger consequences in the bigger picture of life. Just like Joe wanted his family to prosper, and in his selfish motto has compromised and compelled Steve indirectly to commit the sin and experience the punishment in the prison. Though Joe himself is outside the prison and is enjoying the luxuries of the money and the materialistic life that he has collected because of this compromise, still in the heart of hearts, he knows that he is responsible for the death of the 21 pilots and 21 plane crashes. Now that this has become an open secret, and Chris also knows it, Chris wanted his father to realize that what he has done is wrong. Though Kate tries to convince him to forget, Chris is waiting for his father to come and confess. But very surprisingly, Joe doesn't come out onto the stage to confess. A gunshot is heard inside, and Chris goes to check and then comes back telling that Joe has committed suicide and killed himself. Kate tells him not to blame himself because nothing can be done about it. The play ends with the death of Joe. So, All My Sons, the third act is very interesting. At the end, um, the play concludes with the death of Joe. Chris returns from his drive to find Annie, Joe, and Kate outside in the Act 3. Annie, who wants Kate to believe that Larry is truly dead so that she and Chris can be married, shows to Kate a letter that Larry has written to her just one day before his death, in which he said that his plane would go missing in an act of suicide. Out of the shame Larry feels for Joe's and Steve's guilt. Joe, who for a long time had comforted himself with the idea that he was not responsible for his own son's death, realizes when Chris reads the letter aloud that he had not only killed 21 pilots, but Joe also has killed indirectly his own son. Joe remarks that all the soldiers, everybody who is dead in the war, are in fact his sons. In fact, it is this dialogue of Joe that gives the drama its title, All My Sons, because he says all the soldiers who are dead, not only the 21 pilots who are dead because of the plane crash, and the plane crashes because of the mystic or the selfish motto of Joe. All these are definitely his own sons because indirectly he is responsible for the death of them, and they are all his sons. That's why the drama is titled as All My Sons. So Joe remarks that all the soldiers are his sons and goes upstairs, feigning that he will turn himself in to the small town's jail. But a gunshot is heard. Joe has killed himself in the house, and though Chris tells his mother outside that he didn't intend for this to happen, Kate tells Chris and Annie calmly to go far away and start a new family elsewhere because the guilt that has ravaged the Keller family can bring them nothing but harm. And it is in this way that the play ends with the suicide that is committed by Joe. And before committing suicide, Joe confesses that everybody who is dead, including the 21 pilots, his own son Larry, and anybody who is dead on the war because of his wrong decision, are all his sons. Thus, the play ends, and on the screen, we could see all the characters. We could find the Keller family, we could find the Lube family, we could find the doctor's family. We also could find Larry and his sorry, we could find Larry and Anne. We could find Larry and Anne over there, and we also could find the character of George, who happens to be Anne's brother, who is responsible for revealing the entire um, secret of Joe and Steve. Thus, we come to the end of this very famous and beautiful drama by Arthur Miller titled as All My Sons. Thank you very much for having a patient listening. Bye for now.